it may not be a sales channel. But anyway, what decisions will we have to make about the delivery method and location of preparation facilities before we start to analyse potential profitability? So, sure, I guess where you are all based, let me have a look. Aswadi, Gavin, Kumari, Suchi, Trost, Wilfred, and Ziad. I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the idea of delivery pizzas. Certainly, I think they're pretty widespread in most major cities. That there will be places that make pizzas, and then they send off their delivery drivers. And I think the ideas come from a Bombay, I think, where they were doing deliveries years and years and years ago. But yes, the delivery of meals was a new scenario for the exam on pizza time. So here we might, and that would lend itself to distribution channel profitability and comparisons with the profitability that you generate by that, as opposed to customers coming and collecting them, or even customers coming and then placing their orders, waiting, and then having them then receiving their goods. So it's unlikely that distribution would be a question for us, but what could be a question is product profitability and the opportunity to use activity-based costing. Now, this is the way that it was answered, or this is the this was how the examiner commented on the way it was answered in February. There was a general vagueness about how to identify profitability. Apart from identifying the lack of existing market knowledge or experience, some candidates suggested analysis as a competition or trialling pilot areas. And then they've got, again, the choice of vehicles and methods of location and production was scantily covered, and almost no consideration of the potential conflicts between restaurants and delivery staff. So we're not likely to get that sort of scenario, because you could imagine making pizzas in a kitchen of a pizza restaurant and orders coming in that are having to be sent out on the mopeds, taking precedence perhaps over an order that's coming for a table, until the restaurant staff begin to sort of resent the delivery staff. But what you might have is the issue of how are we going to prioritize the products that we're taking orders for. If we continue to have a constraint on our capacity, then we need to be looking in detail about the individual profitability of the products that we're making. Once we've got that, then we could be rejecting certain customers. I've already suggested that if we're looking at small-time businesses, they may not suit Sparkspace, because Sparkspace may well find that the profitability that they get by having to install and assemble and all those additional overheads that they incur. Let me just go back just to remind you of my little list. The design consultancy, the installation costs, the maintenance costs, the assembly costs, all those overhead cost pools may well work out very high when we're dealing with a small customer, but they are relatively lower because a bigger customer is spending a lot more money. And that may mean that we would prefer to not deal with too many small customers. So what does it say here? There was a general vagueness about how to identify profitability. So hopefully we're not going to have that issue, that we're going to recognize that, sure, and I showed you earlier, I'll show you again, that we've got a profitability measure of a sort where I've taken the revenue for the different types of server and then deducted the expenses that we incur, and of course recognize that they don't include the labor costs. But we could get more information that would enable us to then identify the profitability from an activity-based management angle. Yeah, we would need a bit of market knowledge, but if we don't have it, we tell the examiner that we don't have it. And yes, if we've got a new product, we've got to recognise that that may well be taking over capacity that was previously used for something else, and that then brings us into the area of the lost contribution on products that we can no longer make if we're going to introduce a new one. Okay. I'm still open to questions. Am I making sense? Can you see the application that would apply to Spark Space? Okay. I'll move on to slide number 19, and sure, I'll keep looking at this. Right, learning curves. I've talked a little bit about learning curves, trying to go into a bit more detail. But here, let's have a look at this. This was very much in relation to the pizza delivery system, but most members of the working party believed that there would be a steep learning curve associated with a new venture. I disagree, but I was in a very small minority, so perhaps I was mistaken. The implementation of this project will be a major undertaking in itself, and we'll need to think about the most efficient way to break it down into sensible phases. I need you to reply to this email with your thoughts on the following questions. What are the significant learning curve issues associated with providing a home delivery service? So what would be the learning curve issues associated with a new server that we might be producing? Let's imagine that we've been approached by the education department of a major country. This is a country education department has contacted us and said, we want you to produce the servers for, let's make it a nice number, 64 universities. That's rather massive, isn't it? Maybe 32. But I think you can see why I've chosen that particular number, because of the way in which the doubling effect works. So it would then give us an opportunity to be able to discuss the learning curve and how we're able to drive down costs, particularly if we're bringing out what in most respects are 64 identical products. So the implementation of this project will be a major undertaking. Well, it would certainly be a major undertaking for SparkSpace to have to supply 64 universities with their servers. And we will need to think about the most efficient way to break it down into sensible phases. And I need you to reply to this with what are the significant learning issues associated with providing servers for so many universities, and how would you establish the learning rate? So how would we go about identifying the learning rate? We may well be using experienced staff, but they're new to a particular set of processes. So we need to be able to recognize how the learning rate would apply there. Now let's see the areas that the examiner, given that this has happened in February, will they be looking for if they ask this question in August? Right, task 2 opened with the requesting actions to outline the learning curve implications and continued with a request for the definition of major stages in the project implementation. There was a fairly clear demarcation between candidates who knew the mechanisms of the learning curve and those who just waffled. The best candidates were able to apply the theory in context. This is a repetition, isn't it, of the point that I had earlier, that it's well worth it for me just to highlight this, because when it goes, when it is saved, I want to highlight it. No. Oh, all right, well, I'll just have to do it in bold. Okay. And I'll do it in a bright colour. So, theory in context. Lovely. Helps to reinforce my point that you must always be writing about spark spacing. The best candidates were able to apply the theory in context and highlight difficulties in load balancing of uneven demand, not restricted by numbers of seats available in the restaurant. Fine. That's what happened in February. We can be applying it in the context of completing these servers to distribute them to the universities as required by the education department of whichever government it was. The main element of establishing the learning rate was done well by some candidates and badly by others. The better candidates identified the steps in the process which are fixed, e.g. oven time in their case. In our case, we would have the basic assembly. We would then be dealing with the specifics that would relate to the universities, and maybe at the final stages, any individual tweaking that would be applicable only to individual universities. Very few highlighted the coordination tasks and the scheduling difficulties in passing control, restaurant to delivery. This is a major practical issue. So we would have a practical issue, and we may well have a timing issue, given that universities tend to want to have their servers up and running by a particular point in the year. And I would say, if that was to crop up in your exam, then just watch out carefully, because if we've got 64 servers to produce, our learning curve may well be constrained to about 16. If we have to, if we're only able to use our staff on the first 16 that are produced, because it may be that we have to employ additional staff and an additional facility, and then we are starting the learning curve from scratch again for the others that have to be issued to the other universities. So do watch out for little hiccups like that are testing your ability to apply the general theory in the specific scenario that they've given you. I hope I'm getting yes and yes still, but yap was from one person. Okay. So that was that one. Next, well, we've talked about the Porter's value chain already, and this cropped up a second time within the February exam. I mean, I'll show you this syllabus again just to see how this can lend itself in. Yeah, the value chain crops up here within the discuss techniques. We talked about life cycle costing, didn't we? But the value chain, the management of contribution generated throughout the chain. So don't be surprised to see the value chain reappearing in our exam. And as you can see, it turned up in two different variance in the February one. Keep going. So the second part of the question, candidates were supposed to use Porter's value chain model to discuss ways that profitability. Weaker candidates clearly didn't know the Porter's value chain in full, so only part answers were achieved. Okay, this is good because it shows you what the examiner is looking for. Some candidates discuss Porter's 5 forces, so that they've answered a question that the examiner didn't ask. There were also candidates that instead of discussing Porter's value chain model, to discuss ways to make cost savings, instead looked at how to improve profitability by looking at different revenue strategies. Look at this. If you don't answer the question that they've asked, it's very hard for the examiner to give you marks. So again, this didn't fully meet the question requirements, so marks were limited for these answers. So when you go into this exam, you make sure that you know Porter's value chain and that you've applied Spark Space within the value chain, and you can see how each of the elements, each of the activities is either contributing to the margin or not, as the case may be. We've looked at Porter's value chain already, so I won't look at it again. Okay, now this is a question that was to do with the conflict between performance measures, and it was on variant 5. So this was the final of the 5 variants. It was section 2, element 3, and so that just goes to show that this was a question where a section had 3 questions in it. So roughly speaking, if there's a 45-minute section, this would be worth about 8 marks. I just have to look at the likely impact of the project on the group results on the basis that the project is implemented across the whole group. I've calculated the following results, which now need some review and interpretation. Right, hopefully every one of you, let me see how many there are of you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and presumably the 7th. All 7 of you, and all 103 of you on the recording, can instantly tell me the formula for working out the operating profit margin, the formula for working out the average sales per square metre, and the formula for working out the asset turnover. 3 vitally important ratios, and here we can see that the particular project would lead to a decline in the operating profit margin. This particular project would lead to an increase in average sales per square metre, and it would lead to an increase in the asset turnover. So, fair enough, they've made some comments, but as with all these exams, you have to be quite on the ball in terms of your own judgment of what's going on. Operating profit margin means the profit divided by the sales revenue. The average sales per square metre, well, we don't know the background, but if the square metres has stayed the same, that would mean that the sales revenue is higher after the project was implemented, so that we are getting effectively 20% more from each square metre of selling space. And the asset turnover, the number of times that the assets are turned over, in other words, how much the revenue is divided by the capital employed. Now, I wonder if I can do this underneath. I can. Okay. I want you to tell me the answer to this little sum. You don't have, yeah, I want you to tell me the answer to this little sum. Operating profit margin. Oh. Some of you, I think, will probably be guessing this already. Times asset turnover equals. Come on, who's going to be the first person to tell me the answer? One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. I was expecting lots and lots of people to want to show off that they knew this. This could be in your exam next month. Again, I wouldn't be expecting you to do the sums, but I would expect you to have the fundamental understanding. Oh, well done, Charles. You are the best. Thank you very, very much indeed. Return on capital employed. And, of course, there's this general recognition that the operating profit margin is operating profit divided by revenue. Asset turnover is revenue divided by capital employed. So, if you multiply the two together, you're getting operating profit divided by capital employed, return on capital employed. Oh, excellent, excellent. See, I can see you've got there as well. Excellent. Well done. Now, I've got my calculator here. So while we're on this, let's just see what the two were. Not to say that this kind of thing would appear again, but interesting. So the return on capital employed before, according to my calculations, was 37.72%. I'm just as happy with 38%. I don't need bags of detail. And the other one's gone to 38.2%. So in certain respects, we've got a pretty similar percentage for the return on capital employed. The fact that I've given a couple of decimal points means that we actually can see that it's increased slightly. So what we've got here is a growing revenue at the same time as we've got a reduction in the margin. So we could have a scenario here where the company has chosen to reduce their prices, perhaps offer a discount, or it could be that the operating costs have actually risen, and as a result they have reduced the margin. But whichever way around it is, it's meant that the operating profit margin has gone down. But despite that, the asset turnover has gone up. So here, quite an important fundamental for us to recognise. Now let's continue in the same vein as we have with these previous questions. The final part on the ratios was generally poor, so make sure you know your ratios. So if there are 5 of you who didn't know that was the return on capital employed, then over the next couple of days, knuckle down and master that. The quality of the answers was not good. Many answers were very brief and barely said anything. From a fall in profit is bad. Few candidates discussed all 3 ratios, Many missed out the asset turnover, and the ones that did could not say much at all. Ratios are a very basic tool for accountancy. It's surprising how many candidates could not discuss 3 ratios well. So certainly, make sure that as you get ready for this exam, that you are ready for your ratio question. Right. I'll now move on to what I think is my final question. So when we had all of these tasks, we've looked at, we've looked at the value chain twice. We've looked at the potential opportunities. We looked at learning curve, and we looked at a conflict between 2 different performance measures. Now we're going to advise on value analysis, and I've gone into a little bit more detail on this. So here we have a scenario. Many of you will probably be familiar with pizza restaurants, and given that they tend to target families within their marketing, then it makes sense for them to have a play area for them. But here, they're now not sure whether to keep the play area and increase the restaurant space, or whether to keep the play area, and obviously having the play area attracts a particular market segment. Not having that would lose it. This first part was not done well, with many people giving disjointed answers that just mentioned everything they could think about value and not really applying it to the question. Customer numbers within each customer group will change with the removal of the play area, and the impact of this change cannot be predicted. So we need to recognize that when we're looking at our servers, that they have to be applicable. It's quite possible, given the work that we've done with the university, that there will be perhaps medium-sized firms who we would consider to be appropriate for their own servers, but they could be switching to use the cloud arrangements that become available to them if they are they're using the ones that we've got at the university. So, for example, the Spark Innovate project is expected to prove attractive to companies operating, and they are, what we've got here, 2/3 of businesses, so they are looking at using these data storage and arrangements so that they don't actually have to have their own computers themselves, their own servers. So we need to be sufficiently familiar with that from the pre-scene that we're able to answer our questions. It is a change in customer numbers and customer profitability that's relevant to the decision rather than the current customer analysis. So that recognition that if things change, we need to be looking at the future and how that's going to be, rather than trying to make decisions based on the assumption that things don't change. Most candidates just discuss the value of the present customers and do not consider possible impacts for change. So here, I looked a little bit at product profitability. The server hardware is huge. It's the largest source of revenue. Each HPC earns a lot more surplus, and the growth, say, from 105 to 106. So, just in case you need a reminder, let's just look at this. They were selling 105 HPC systems, which brought in 346 million Westland dollars. So if they could sell one more, it would bring in, well, on average, 3.3 million So the same average surplus would add a lot more to operating profit. And an ABC approach would help by giving a more accurate product cost so that we would know how much each of those additional products would cost us. Now, yes, we've discussed learning curve, and Ziad asked his questions, and I think that made that quite relevant. Okay. So we're into the last 8 minutes of today's class. I will just recap on what we've looked at by going back to our syllabus page and saying this is where I started. P2, cost planning and analysis for competitive advantage in the context of Spark Space. And we went through the activity-based management. I talked briefly about TQM, but didn't go through it. I went and talked about the long-term profits in terms of the techniques that we can use to enhance them. We looked at the application of learning curves, and then we saw the ways in which the examiner likes to test them, and we saw the ways in which previous exam candidates have sort of fallen over when they've been answering them, so that we don't fall into those traps. In the final 7 minutes, any questions now on this area? In leadership skills, one key thing is driving performance. Is it specifying what can be done to improve performance? In our That's fine, Ziad. No, I agree. It isn't. Let me do a new slide. I think you're talking about the criteria of the exam, and as you are probably all well aware, your criteria is based on technical, business, people, and leadership. And sure, we've got some marks for integration as well. And leadership marks are based on making recommendations. So if I do a duplicate slide and then just so recommendations you may be expected to identify short-term and long-term. You should always have justifications. So don't just make a recommendation, justify it. Ideally, you would have a series of action plans or action points so that you're showing how that recommendation will be implemented. And I would say the implications, and oh dear, sorry. So let me just make that number 5. I mean, it doesn't matter, it could be 4 or 5. But I'm making it 5 here. So a typical implication would be if we are taking expert management time away from one activity to focus on another activity, then that is an implication of the new activity. It could be that if we're having to take the finance that we've got available, imagining that we've got a capital rationing scenario, by investing in one thing, it's denying us the opportunity of being able to invest in another. It doesn't have to be that you are specifying what can be done to improve performance, but the likelihood is that it would be. It could be that your recommendations are to do with an ethical issue or something along those lines. Okay. Ziad asks about taking a position. I would always say that is my recommendation. I do not recommend the rather woolly answers that I think sometimes are welcomed on university courses, where you say, well, we need more information, or if only we could, then we might. No, I think we are writing for the owners of a business and they want to know what we are recommending. So yes, I do recommend taking a position. I think you saw in one of the feedbacks, the examiner had said that there was a particular question about Porter's generic strategies, and it didn't spell it out, but they'd said that it was more difficult for the candidates to get the high marks if they'd have gone for the cost leadership approach. But between the lines, what they're saying is they made a decision, and because they made a decision, they would earn the marks. If they'd have been sitting on the fence, some of my students that I have in my class, you know, the ones that I teach face to face, talk about getting splinters if they sit on fences, and that's exactly what the examiner would be, that they want you to be able to recognize that sitting on the fence or not making a decision is the wrong thing to do. You need to be making it clear that you have a particular view on these things. So thank you for that question. Yeah. A couple of final slides are just to do with planning your answers. And finally, you've got my email address should you wish to contact me. I make it 9 o'clock. So we've come to the end of our 5th class. Thank you very, very much for coming along each time and listening to me. I hope you found it useful. I've quite enjoyed being able to talk to you. I certainly consider that I know a lot more about the server industry now than I ever did. And I wish you all the very best. I would love to hear from you, particularly if you're telling me that you passed. Yes, and I very much hope that you'll be telling Andrew that you'd very much like to hear from me for future courses. So, on the assumption that there's no further questions, I'm going to stop the recording, and we will, and I'll leave you to let me know how you've got on in your exam. So all the very, very best. I'm going to name you all so that you know that I'm talking to every one of you individually. Ziad, Wilfred, Trost, Suchi, Kumeri, Gavin, Aswali. I really, really hope that you will be all to be very successful. So all the very, very best. Thank you and good night.